Thank you, Dame Leslie. And what a great quote to end on. It takes the willingness to try. And that's what Kate Womersley, who is our next speaker, did, writing to me on the 14th of January, asking for NIHR's sex and gender policy. She wrote to me on the 14th of January, 2021. Asking for information about NIHR sex and gender policy. And today we're in a position where we've worked with Kate to deliver a policy later this year. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now to close us off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Esther. Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here today. My name is Kate Womersley. I'm co-principal investigator of the Message Project at the George Institute for Global Health at Imperial College. I'm also an NHS doctor in psychiatry working up in Edinburgh in Scotland. So I've been leading the Message Project with Professor Robin Norton since 2021. And today I'm going to share with you the background to this work, how it's led to partnership with the NIHR on their sex and gender policy, and how we achieved this impact through UK-wide collaboration. I'll speak about why Message has focused its efforts on producing a sex and gender policy framework rather than other possible interventions in the sector, then describe the process by which the framework has been co-designed with our stakeholders across the research sectors of the 4 nations, including funders and, really importantly, people with lived experience. I'll reflect on the remarkable spirit of teamwork among our stakeholders, which has enabled the project to surpass its initial aims. And then looking to the future, NIHR's Sex and Gender Policy launch today is a landmark, and it's absolutely worth celebrating fulsomely as we're doing in this event. But it's not the end of the story, as Gail said. Now, sex and gender inclusion as a condition of funding is in the hands of researchers who we are relying on to upskill and innovate in this area. There's also an urgent need to think about the ways in which sex and gender intersect with other characteristics relevant to health and disease, particularly race and ethnicity. So since the pandemic, there has been a growing policy environment supportive of sex and gender inclusive changes to research. We've heard from Leslie Regan today about the Women's Health Strategy, and one of its targets has been to disaggregate research findings by sex, and ensure greater inclusion of women in research. Where I work up in Scotland, our Women's Health Plan shares these ambitions. Meanwhile, the third policy there you can see on the screen, the NHS has published its hopes to make advances in personalised medicine and to better target treatment to individuals. However, there can be no personalised medicine without better data about sex and gender's relationship with health and disease. And these data are not currently being routinely collected or analysed as standard in UK research. In terms of financial impacts, in December 2024, NHS Confederation released this excellent report, the fourth on the screen, on women's health economics, which highlighted that many conditions affect females and males differently and disproportionately, while pointing out that, and I quote, countless conditions where sex differences are not yet known because the research has not been done. And I'm really hopeful that NIHR's new policy will contribute to changing this and improving things. Overall, on this side of the Atlantic, at least, there is a growing awareness, as Gail explained, that inclusion is important for research, it's important for value for money, it's important for advancing scientific accuracy and rigour, and it's essential to achieve better health outcomes for all. So why has Message focused on research funders? Well, when we started thinking, as Esther mentioned in 2021, about improving sex and gender inclusion in UK research, it really wasn't clear where to start. No part of the research pipeline initially seemed like an obvious candidate and a ready candidate to take the lead. While creation and translation of new scientific knowledge doesn't always follow a predictable straight line to clinical impact, there is a common route from research funders who support projects to get underway, through universities and institutes where research is carried out, to articles published in scientific journals, which go on then to inform, if we're lucky, clinical standards and practice guidelines. And that ultimately shapes healthcare delivery to patients in the NHS and across the globe. So we felt that to get the best chance of influencing those downstream improvements, Message wanted to focus on research funders to take the first step. And I'm really glad to say they have risen to this challenge brilliantly. Thinking globally, until very recently, the UK has been far behind peer countries in terms of sex and gender inclusion in research, as Caroline so brilliantly explained. The US recognised the problem over 3 decades ago, and I think it's a bit dizzying for us to think about how far forward they were back then. Since 1993, with the NIH Revitalisation Act, this meant that research funded by the NIH in the US had a requirement to include women and minorities. Then the US introduced its sex as a biological variable policy in 2016, and Canada and the EU also now have sex and gender policies in place. It's sort of understandable to maybe become a bit disillusioned about policies. Like, if there are these policies in place in other countries, is there any evidence that policies actually work? Well, Haberfield and Tannenbaum published a really excellent evaluation of the Canadian Institutes for Health Research's sex and gender policy and its impact over the first 10 years since being launched. This paper showed that sex and gender policies can have a marked positive effect. So what they found was that applications that integrated sex increased nearly 4-fold, and those which integrated gender increased nearly 3-fold over those first 10 years since the policy was introduced. I think also crucially that applications that were scored highly overall for sex and gender integration were more likely to be funded by Canada's major national research funder. Meanwhile, back in the UK, it's 2021, colleagues and I at the George Institute for Global Health were curious about how the UK compared in its efforts to account for sex and gender. We weren't very optimistic, just as Caroline wasn't when she was fighting Invisible Women, and couldn't really find anything out there. We carried out preliminary research, which showed that of the 17 major research funders in the UK and the 4 major regulators, not a single one of them had a sex and gender policy in place for the research that they are funding or evaluating. Despite this gap, and it was worse than we thought, we did also hear from funders and regulators that they were interested, they were curious, they were committed to the idea of improving sex and gender inclusion. And so we started Message with a focus on funders to profoundly improve the quality of medical research in the UK by increasing sex and gender considerations in biomedical health and care research. Our central aim has been to co-design a policy framework, as I've said, with our stakeholders from across the research sector. And the importance was that this framework could then be used as a template for different funders and organisations to adopt as they needed. This approach also ensured a consensus of opinion and a more streamlined experience for researchers, so they weren't having to become familiar with lots of different policies, which may have been confusing and actually reduced uptake. We want anyone applying for research funding to be prompted to say in their application how they're going to account for sex and gender when designing their study, when recruiting participants, collecting data, analysing that data, and then finally reporting their results. This week, as we all know, marks International Women's Day, and I want to pause on the fact that the Message vision was led by women and headed up in its day-to-day operations by early career researchers and clinicians. This was absolutely not a top-down project, and our small team saw practices and gaps in our workplaces and specialties which we felt strongly were unacceptable, and we then wanted to do something about it. Trust and responsibility was placed in us by the Wellcome Trust, who funded this research, but also with funders like NIHR, who have taken this project so seriously from its very beginnings. I also want to pay tribute to 3 extraordinary women at NIHR, Esther McCuker, Emma Hadfield-Hudson, and Nikki Hopkins, who have championed Message in their organisation, have engaged deeply with our events, and have absolutely believed in what we've been trying to do and why it matters. So our vision and energy wouldn't have been sufficient if people with a wealth of experience hadn't also supported Message with their time and knowledge. So many experts have amplified and improved our work. Firstly, Professor Robin Norton at the George Institute, who has steered this project and encouraged an early career team to take the lead. Our advisory group, some of whom you can see here, Esther McCuker's there, and they have collaborated across the globe, from Sydney to Stanford, contributing expertise from clinical medicine, epidemiology, social science, as well as research and publishing. We've really been extraordinarily lucky. But actually, in practice, Message is an even larger group of 50 stakeholders who represent the research pipeline in the UK. First and foremost are patients and people with lived experience who have shared with us the ways in which research is not working for them or serving their needs. This group includes people from a diversity of sexes and gender identities who have experienced a range of different medical conditions. We heard from intersex experts and representatives from the trans community. From the medical funders, they have been our primary partners for the project's outputs. We've had representation from these large national funders like NIHR and MRC, as well as much smaller charitable funders that may represent a single disease like Epilepsy Action or Breast Cancer Now. And the Association of Medical Research Charities have coordinated with us and been really immensely important for ensuring that we hear the challenges faced by funding organisations that are much smaller than the NIHR, for example, with similarly small resources and budgets. They may just have one permanent member of staff, but are nonetheless really committed to making changes in this space. Crucially, we've also been joined over the last 2 years by UK regulators like the MHRA and NICE. We've been joined by medical journals, including the BMJ, the Lancet, individual publishers like Elsevier and PLOS, the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS England. We've ensured that the devolved nations are all represented and they're adopting Message in exciting ways. And I think just this slide captures the wealth of expertise and time that has been dedicated from across the UK. And we've been struck by just how engaged our stakeholders have continued to be over 2 years, which is a period of time when fatigue may well have set in. Every stakeholder that started this process with us has remained involved in Message and is implementing changes in their organisations. Observing this collaborative energy and the resulting impact has really fed my already quite strong optimism that the UK is committed to the highest quality science, which works for everyone in society. The power of this collaboration has not gone unnoticed. Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of The Lancet, who spoke at the Message webinar in November, had this to say about the stakeholders' nationwide teamwork. I so much welcome these recommendations, which have come from the kind of collaboration that I've never seen before in 25 to 30 years of working in UK medical research. A collaboration between editors, publishers, researchers, clinicians, patient representatives and funders. It just doesn't happen, and it should happen more often. Orchestrating four-nation cross-sector collaboration has been a worthwhile challenge, and I have an extraordinary team that have made these events as flawless as really I could imagine. The Message process has been structured around 4 day-long policy labs, which are hybrid to ensure maximum accessibility and attendance. These are intense, they're highly interactive, they're solution-orientated workshops, and they encourage knowledge exchange through facilitated activities. Ross Power, excellent facilitator over the course of the events, and really rich discussion. You can imagine the debate has been lively. Yes, there have been plenty of disagreements, but I think what marks out this space and the people involved is that the disagreements have all been ones that have focused on co-creating the best possible deliverables by the end of the project. As you can see, the labs took us from May 2023, where we were identifying our group's shared priorities, workshopping the policy framework and its precise wording, to looking ahead about how to grow and sustain Message's work beyond 2024. And in April last year, we finished the policy framework, which individual funders like NIHR are now using to inform the changes underway across UK research. With any change, it's understandable that there is some apprehension among researchers about what will be required of them. And over the last year of socialising Message with the research community and talking to a wide variety of funders, universities, researchers, there are recurrent questions that we hear. Firstly, what about the men? This is fundamentally not a policy which will only benefit women. Men also stand to gain from fair recruitment, from sex and gender disaggregated analyses, from reporting results which make clear where differences exist between men and women. As you all are aware, there are plenty of medical conditions which disproportionately affect men. COVID-19 mortality is one that's very present for many of us the last few years. In my work in psychiatry and schizophrenia, it's much more prevalent in men, and men have shorter lifespans overall when compared with women. Sex and gender disaggregated approaches will help us better understand why this is the case. Intersex, non-binary and transgender people will also benefit from researchers' growing interest in the mechanisms and the pathways by which sex and gender affect health outcomes. The second myth is that research is going to become incredibly expensive. Well, to design studies that generate statistically significant sex differences does require more money. But statistical significance is not a requirement of the policy changes. What we're asking for is diversity, which allows people to see themselves in research, and inclusivity also provides data that then can be used for meta-analysis to make those broader claims about sex differences. We also need to reflect as a society about whether we're prepared to pay more for higher quality research that's reproducible and better reflects all patients to maximize benefits and minimize any clustered harms. As a researcher, it may already feel that your time is very much taken up, and is this just not yet another thing for researchers to do? Certainly it is a new requirement and there will be upskilling needed to meet the standards, but sex and gender intentional design just extends the skills in a researcher's tool belt. Also, I think we have minimized that additional burden because this policy framework has been agreed across the sector, which minimizes that additional effort of familiarizing yourself with lots of different policies. And finally, the policy is absolutely not prescriptive about how to account for sex and gender. The onus, the creativity, the opportunity is on researchers to think for themselves about how considerations of sex and gender might be relevant to their particular research question and justify that approach that they intend to take through the course of the project. We at Message are supporting funders like NIHR to implement the policy framework, and we've provided guidance for researchers, for supporting reviewers when evaluating applications, and also tools to explain the policies within organisations and to charitable communities. For researchers, we're launching an online course later this year, which will be available internationally through Imperial, as well as educational materials to support learning. You can access these and hear any updates on our project website, messageproject.co.uk. The Message team has rightly been questioned about why we focused on sex and gender and why not other protected characteristics like race, ethnicity, disability, age, all incredibly important and pertinent to health and disease. We've also been asked about why we're not looking at the intersections between these characteristics. Gail mentioned in her first presentation that NIHR's recent and ongoing engagement with the research sector about race and ethnicity is underway. And I'm really proud that, facilitated by NIHR, Message is collaborating with the NHS Race and Health Observatory to start this important work and to share our learnings from the last 3 years. This has always been our aim, and we've always wanted to share that with researchers that this is coming, and it's just excellent to see NIHR supporting this next step. Back to the pipeline where we began, with research funders doing their bit to ensure better integration of sex and gender, what else needs to happen? Well, we're working with universities to train researchers in sex and gender considerations and to develop interest in sex and gender, and how to do that in an informed way through their research. We continue our work with medical publishers in a focused project to really tighten triage processes and ensure that papers are considering sex and gender and disaggregating their data accordingly. You may have heard of the SAGER guidelines, which are excellent, and many journals have signed up to them, but what we're noticing is they're not being routinely enforced. As a clinician, I'm particularly interested in how quickly high-quality sex and gender-informed research can then be translated into clinical practice. There's already a wealth of research out there showing clear sex differences, but it's still not acknowledged in the guidelines that we use as doctors to treat our patients. So Message is working with NICE and the MHRA to consider how sex and gender can appropriately and safely be integrated into their processes and recommendations. Patients are increasingly aware of the unacceptable gender data gap in health and are starting to demand better from research that informs their care. This, I think, is particularly important for taxpayer-funded research, such as that supported by the NIHR. And for that reason, today's launch of the NIHR Sex and Gender Policy is a true landmark in UK research. I'm delighted that we're celebrating this change, which really is the result of so many people's hard work. It is a turning point to ensure that research works for everyone, no matter their sex or gender. And this now relies on your commitment and enthusiasm to spread the message in your organisations and your communities and through the examples of your own work. At the George Institute, there are many people who have dedicated extraordinary amounts of time, their ideas, their enthusiasm to message. Thank you so much to you all. And for anyone who'd like to speak to me and our team at Message, please do get in touch with us. We're engaged in many different modes of collaboration, and we'd be very interested to hear from you. Thanks so much.